they had a mythical significance for me. The one with the lance-like structures that pierce the trees refers to Saint Sebastian, who is, there are many Renaissance paintings about him, and he was a Roman soldier of some rank who converted to Christianity, and when he was found out, he was killed by arrows. And so this refers to him, as well as a wall piece that is called Quiver for Saint Sebastian, so that his body becomes the quiver. It carries all these arrows longitudinally through his body. It's a pretty grotesque image, if you think about it. But what I try to do with my work is to try to balance the scariness, the threatening quality, grotesque quality at times, with something that's aesthetically interesting. And the third part of the henge has a sinuous wood structure that's it comes from laurel branches that are meant to represent the mythical dragon or snakes that were set by one of the Greek gods who was on was on the Greek side of the Trojan War, and Laocoon, who advised the Trojans not to take in the hollow horse. And so I've forgotten which god it was, sent the serpent to kill Laocoon and his two sons. And that sculpture was discovered in the 15th century underground in Italy. It was carved by Greeks in the Roman era. And I put it into henge form because it evokes the kind of primitivism and ritual that henges are meant to convey. I could keep on talking about other things, but there are other people here.
Let me add one thing. I did a little bit of research, and a black oak, which this tree was, 5 feet off the ground and 4 feet in diameter, which that was approximately right, correct?
Yeah.
Clocks in at about 192 years old, give or take a decade.
Yeah.
So that was a prodigy of a tree, a patriarch of the campus.
Yeah, to me, it's a privilege just to be inside the tree, to look and see what the history of the tree is, because you see vestiges of the early branching of the young tree. They're there. All those cones that are coming out are evidence of the old branches.
And that's on the inside, and it's almost like a negative or a mirror image of the way the branches grew on the outside.
Right. And there's no evidence on the outside of what's in the inside.
Let me ask you one other question, and you don't need to answer this if it's too personal.
It's too personal.
I notice
You took
the
words right out of my mouth.
I think that's the price of being an artist. You get asked a lot of personal questions. So I noticed one of your pieces here is titled Colloquy for Clint. And I had to look this up. Colloquy is conversation. That did not immediately pop into my memory.
It's kind of a formal,
Right.
Yeah.
formal conversation.
Yeah.
And the other is, what is it, Requiem?
Yes,
Requiem for Clint.
yes.
So I have to ask, what's the backstory there, if you care to talk about it?
Yeah, a lot of my work has to do with death and resistance to it and the beginnings of new life despite death or from death. A colleague and friend of mine died in his mid-late 40s with a malignant melanoma, leaving behind 3 children and his wife. And it was terrible for all his friends as well as for the family. There was a large black oak on his property right in front of the house, which came down not long after he died. And I asked for some of the wood and held it for many years before I really got working on it. I had it for about 20 years before I started working on it. So these are memorials from my friend, Clint. The Requiem has to do with, there's a subtitle, 1,000 Cuts. The wood, to me, represents slices in his life and in the lives of his friends, severe, agonizing cuts. The colloquy refers to his love of and work at a farmhouse that he owned as a second home in Massachusetts, not far from here. He had a barn and horses, and he did a lot of work there. So it's a barn door with his trees, pieces, small pieces, the ones that were left over from the other 2 works I did for him. They go up, crawl up the door and beyond, as if they were trying to live and make something of themselves, although they're just waste fragments, parts of a body. So it represents a way of transcending death.
Thank you, Joe. And Joan, thank you. I just realized I better check my own pocket device here. Leave it right there where it can't get me in trouble. And Joan, I have a couple of questions for you. If I can even decipher my scrawled notes here. I checked your website. Joe has a very good website, by the way. And I checked your website, and I have to share something from it, if it's all right. And it was part of your artist statement, which I thought was just very lucidly put and very from the heart. I find a lot of artist statements to be turgid, incomprehensible, or not to the point. And depending on which magazines I might be looking at. But when I see an artist statement that really gets direct to the point, I appreciate it. And also it's to the point of the show here, all things natural, so I would like to share this. And this is just a snippet. And if anyone in here writes artist statements for a living, I apologize for that last comment.
Thank you.
I've seen a lot of good ones. And here we go. I've examined the tenuous, ebbing boundaries between reality and perception. I've asked questions about human relationships, the nature of home, my relationship to nature, and the significance of the quotidian. The ordinary art of living is endlessly complex and uncertain. It is through the ordinary that, for me, the world resonates. I like that. That reminds me of something I believe it was William James said, which was a kind of dumbed down synthesis of that, which was happiness consists in paying attention to the ordinary details of life. And I see that as being a lot of what this show is about, of looking at the grain and texture of wood, or the texture of paint and the juxtaposition of colors, but the details right in front of us as they present themselves, unmediated and without a whole lot of verbiage. So I would love to hear, Joan, about your two pieces behind me here, what the process is. What I'm seeing are hands and vegetation, and what gets more, what could be more prosaic and ordinary than hands and vegetation. But how in the world did you produce these? Could you talk about the process, please?
Yeah, the process is actually simpler than it may appear. These date back to around 2002, maybe. And there are a lot of questions in your statement. There's lots of different directions I could go with my various answers, but to be specific to these, I started many, many years ago, undergraduate school, painting, drawing, my first great loves. And in photography, I am often interested, among many other things, in the relationship of photography to other art forms. I think, to get back to the original statement, when I was in undergraduate school, you're constantly asked, well, what are you about? What is your work about? And probably every artist here has had to struggle with that and has had to write innumerable statements. And I remember being young going, I'm interested, I think, in I didn't even know it was what I was interested in as an artist. As a person, I was interested in the question of what does it mean to be human? And now, many, many years later, I can reflect back and say that in some sense, trying to answer that question is what all my many, many varying bodies of work are about, because I've done many different bodies of work. It's not like, it may not appear to be one coherent vision. And so in trying to write statements and address these questions, I've been over many years asking myself what ties these different bodies of work together. And it actually is the very simplicity of my life. I sometimes use the phrase random thoughts and casual glances, that's where the images and the ideas come from. Excuse me. And if I reflect on my life, it's been pretty ordinary. Other than the fact that I make art, it's like I get up and I go to work, I raised a kid, I cook dinner, nothing very extraordinary. And so that really has become the material for my art making. So these are pretty, if I were to walk into this gallery, I would look at those and think of them as being pretty dramatic. But they really, they come from lots of different sources, and the meaning becomes more layered for me over time. The initial, I never did landscape. I don't even walk in the woods very much. I might go to a park with my daughter when she comes to visit, but basically I'm more of an indoor kind of person. And I grew up in a city, and then the family moved to an inner ring of suburbs, and this was St. Louis. And my big warning from my mother as I got older was, don't you ever go into that park. Don't ever go alone. Don't ever walk on that path. And so I grew up with all the urban fears of the woods. And many years ago, I was invited to be in a show that addressed East Rock and West Rock in New Haven, and I realized after 15 years I had never been to those parks. So the message resonated, and I began to take myself there. And then I got a grant to be a resident at Weir Farm, and I just said, I'm going to take a walk in the woods every day. and I'm going to take a roll of film, but I don't know what I'm going to do. And so that's what I did, and every day I got lost, and at first I was really excited. This is kind of a fun adventure. I liked the edge of danger, and then I, thinking of Disney and Bambi, and then I started to think, well, women get raped in the woods, and you find dead bodies in the woods, and so it became balancing the ideas of fear and fantasy, were my personal meaning of the woods. I've also had the opportunity to go to Poland, and the hands are actually from a friend of mine who's now in Warsaw, but was in New Haven at the time. And when I went, I said, well, I want to go to Białowieża. I was reading, a friend had recommended Simon Schama's book, Landscape and Memory. And it struck me that that's exactly what the woods were. They served as both a place of safety, of refuge, where people escaped to save their lives, and people were brought to be slaughtered. And so, this sort of dichotomy or duality, stays with me. So all of that, there's all of that layered meaning for me, but also, having grown up, studying painting and the history of art, I'm aware of like the abstract expressionist kind of play. The whole linear aspect of it also has to do with my love of drawing. The hands probably, and this is going in another direction, the kind of imagery I encountered in an early stay in Mexico that became very important to me. The actual process is really simple. People helped me a lot. I lived someplace where the landlord gave me a big sink that was in the basement at the time, and I simply collaged 2 negatives and projected them onto the wall, developed with sponges and played with bleaches and toners, hosed it down, and that's the process.
Silver prints, is that
They
right?
are silver prints. They're old-fashioned darkroom prints, yeah. And it's actually fiber paper, which is why it has to be pinned to the wall. Yeah.
I thought it was very interesting for someone who expressed real trepidation about being out in nature, that you went to the deepest, darkest, most primeval forest on the planet.
No. I had this magical idea of what Białowieża was, the last remnant of primeval forest in Europe, really. And I happened to be in Warsaw with friends, and I had the first time I went, and I had expressed this desire to see this place. And my friend Jacek had said, yes, I'll drive you. Well, by the time we got there, it was a picnic with like tons of people coming. And, we drove up there, and I had my equipment, and the entryway was like the entryway to any theme park. I mean, it wasn't as grandiose and developed as in the United States, at least not then, but it was like every kind of booth selling every kind of tourist tchotchke you can imagine. And we're walking on a wooden path, and I was with so many people, I couldn't concentrate. I didn't do any work worthwhile at all there. But, I love the idea of it. I love I love the way it plays in my imagination. My experience of it wasn't what I had imagined, but it certainly stimulated thinking.
This is a World Heritage UNESCO site, by the way.
Yeah. And it was beautiful, but we didn't get deeply enough in because half the people I were with was, I'm tired, let's turn around, let's go back. But it was a different experience.
So is this work an outgrowth of that trip, or is this a new direction?
I think I did this a year or two before I went, but I continued this work. I did a new piece 2 or 3 summers ago. I just edited a piece a few weeks ago. So amongst all my different bodies of work, I freely float back and forth amongst them. Nothing is ever done, or rarely is anything considered done or finished. You know, I work on whatever I work on at the time. You know.
I could ask you when a piece is finished, but we'll
Oh, that piece is finished, but the series is open-ended.
all right.
That's a better clarification.
All right,
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
Thank you, Joan.
You're welcome.
Now, what was your question? No. Well, let me start at the beginning. I want to say I like Joe's work very much, too. In art school, I was painting divided canvases with text down the middle of canvases. Am I okay here? Okay. And then I bought some land on the New Hampshire border, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, to build my little Thoreau hut out of stone. And I have this great piece of land. It's a nice high tor. And I stopped painting for a while, and I started using materials like Joe. I carved 6-foot pieces of standing stone off my cliffs. I rolled them down to the yard on little logs, and I stood them up in kind of a hinge, you know, a semicircle. But to do it, I doused first. And that process of dousing, finding the ley lines in the land where power is, perhaps, when I got a reaction, well, that's where I would put the stones. So I did that kind of work. When I cleared the land, I used hemlock logs to fill in parts of the land, the depressions, and hemlock and beech branches, sort of a thatch, to make outdoor sculpture, rather than clear the land and throw away these great materials. But after a while, I told Joe earlier, he looked a little bit too much like Richard Long. And so he's done that. So I came to do painting again because I found myself always looking at clouds. I was always outdoors, and I said, you know, I think I'll try painting again. So that's where these paintings came from. When I was in art school at Hartford, I started with the divided canvases. You know, that was the era of pop artists. I guess I liked Rosenquist and Robert Indiana. So as far as original, well, I did get ideas from those guys first. Then I came upon, I think I changed it enough to do, you know, something I like. Let's see. You had another question to prod me along here? I forgot what I was...
Okay, that was fascinating. Ley lines, etc. That was fascinating.
By the way, I read that book too you were talking
it's
about.
fascinating.
Yeah.
Okay, specifically, 1971. This Flanagan fellow.
Yeah, Barry Flanagan. Is everyone familiar with the artist Barry Flanagan? I met him. You know, I don't know how I had the nerve, but I went to England and Holland and Germany, and I ran into the artists, or I'd go up to their doorstep, and they invited me in to stay. Barry Flanagan, when I met him, he was in his studio. At the time, he was doing teepee sort of structures with sticks and logs and little canvas. But this day, he was painting his driver and his 3-wood with a name on each, May and W.C. May West and W.C. He was fooling around with his golf clubs. And he said, do you play? And well, I said, sure. And we played golf. And now, isn't that cool that says I played golf with Barry Flanagan, not Arnold Palmer or something like that? You know, Barry Flanagan was a golfer, sort of. So I wanted to remember that. And currently I'm working on painting where I dropped the name of Keith Arnott. I went out to Wales, and he sort of toured me around Tintern Abbey and the Wye Valley. So that's what I have on this next painting. talking about Keith Arnett. And I met Jan Dibbets in Holland. I went to Germany, and I was visiting the Conrad Fischer Gallery in Dusseldorf, and Michael Heiser and Walter Dmytriw were there. And I went out to lunch with them. I wonder if I should do that as a painting, to have lunch with Walter Dmytriw.
Yes, you're on to something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway, this is just recently I got back into the divided canvases and the lettering. But
Fantastic.
I always like the look of text on a painting. So it's just a visual thing. You know, I've never been too analytical of my work or anybody's. I really never had too much to say. So I need another question, if you want any more.
God, that could not have been more interesting, I gotta say.
Well, I often said to people, I don't know if I could answer that, because how useful or interesting is it? But you said it's interesting.
Well, what do you guys think, huh?
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Definitely.
Let's bounce down to John here. And John, tell us a little bit about yourself. Where do these paintings come from? Are these representative of your usual work? Are these a new direction?
No, these are representative. I think I always wanted to be a figure painter, but that just didn't work out. So most of this is in the woods, or we go to Algonquin, Maine every year. That's kind of the family beach vacation. If you've ever seen like the rocks, I love the rocks, and like one of those up there, or actually two of them. I'm kind of fascinated by, rather than the big landscape, I like kind of what fell to the ground, and I think it has a story, and that's kind of where I start. So I take my camera out there, I find what I'm looking for, I take that picture, and then it's that instant when you recognize it, and it's like, that's it. You never get back to that, because I'm chasing the rainbow after that, because then I come home, I paint a canvas black, and I start layering paint on, and I just use I only use a knife, because I just like how you mix your paint, and you put it right on the canvas, and there it is. And then you can kind of mix something else next to it, and you pull it together, and you can draw back into it. And I've always kind of felt I was digging for when I'm painting, rather than building something. I feel like I'm going into it. So I think that, the scenes, they're less important, because I tend to start as you drift through, after you miss that idea, you just work on it. So I kind of do like puzzle pieces. So I finish a part and move to another part. I finish a part and move to the next part. Because I didn't work for a lot of years, and, well, not a lot, but a couple. But I always put off finding the time. So I kind of used to paint everywhere. I'd paint everywhere and come back to what I wanted most. And this is different. I start where I want, and I let the rest kind of work its way into that. So, I just see it. I try to chase that idea, but it never works out, because thoughts drift and you end up in a different place. But I'm okay with that. So I tend to find meaning, I guess, for whatever reason, in these little things, rather than some of the bigger things in the world.
So, John, in the process of creating these just gorgeous paintings with this amazing palette, what comes first, color or composition? What's your first area of concern?
So, like I said, I'll start with a picture, right? So then I compose, I crop whatever I want to do, get the idea, quick chalk sketch, and then it just goes from there. So then the paint goes on, general idea of where I want things, and just kind of let it move wherever it moves to.
How much do you rework it?
I try not to do that much reworking. Like I said, I try to do it like a puzzle piece. So I finish it, I start where I want to start with what's most important to me, and then I build out of that. So once I finish, I usually don't go back over.
All right. What does your studio look like, John?
It is 1/4 of the basement. I got a little side, I got a window, but yeah, I work in the basement. I seem to like going down. So everyone else goes to bed and I slink downstairs and do my thing.
All right, thank you, John. Speaking of studios, I'd like to ask Chuck how he's doing in his new studio. Chuck is up at in Winstead, which is currently giving Torrington a run for its money in the art department, in a fantastic place called Mad River Lofts. And I have to say, I'm jealous. You have light in that room like nowhere else. How has that space changed your work, if at all? I'll kind of come at this through the side door.
The key word that you used is light. And the loft mainly is for painting because I've got into painting after I retired from teaching photography and video and animation and team teaching with Judy. But to me, everything is light. And the studio has very high windows and it's north light. And I was in there yesterday and I was photographing some of the paintings that I want to put on a long overdue website, and it was like totally incredible how the light totally changed these colors. I mean, you're familiar with some of the paintings, that blue indigo that was in the show. And as the thunderstorm came, all of a sudden, you know, these indigos and these French ultramarine blues are totally changing because you're getting this gray-yellow light coming through the windows. And it was like, all of a sudden my painting was like no longer what I had thought it was, and it was like nature was changing the work. So I obviously photographed it, and it was like really cool. And it's not what the real painting looks like, but it's a total, it's a transformation. And, you know, just like life is totally, you know, transforming basically every second or minute that we're fortunate to live, that's what, you know, I think all the artists that I'm, you know, privileged to be at the table with are pretty much, you know, I get the theme that they're all positive people. And, you know, whether you're remembering a loved one who's passed away, you're still, you know, it's the positiveness of having met them and being able to appreciate the short time that they were here with us. So that's kind of just a long question to, the studio is great, and it's been very, I'm much more productive in it. I photograph just about every morning, and then afterwards, unless I'm really into a project, then I'll go in first thing. But I'm in the studio like 4 days a week, and the other times, you know, I'm still photographing every day. Because to me, there is a connection, and you know, my photography is about light, and that minute or millisecond, if you will.
So would you still identify first as a photographer and second as a painter? How does that interaction work for you?
I really think they're very intertwined, and I can't separate it. I would like, I feel privileged if someone calls me an artist because, you know, how do you separate that? I was talking, I forgot who I was talking with. I had a visitor yesterday who's known me for a long time, and you know, she's in her 80s and she lives in Florida, and she heard as a student, she came in, and I said, well, I've only been painting 8 years, but you know, she's seen my photography for decades, and you know, the painting is derivative of what I see, and I think the you know, that's what photography is to me. The only thing that's really different is that I'm in a controlled space, and that's a studio. I love being alone in nature. I mean, I have the woods for my back door, and I feel totally one with, no matter what the weather is, and I don't feel threatened. I feel, you know, you see death in it when you see something dying, like a tree, or I was cross-country skiing, and you know, I saw a bloody leg of a deer, which, you know, a coyote had gotten, and but that's part of the cycle.
I'd have to say that in my experience looking at your photographs is like putting on a pair of magic spectacles that transforms the quotidian landscape that I might otherwise not look at with the same intensity.
Thank you. I mean, they're all very personal. I mean, what I pick is personal, and for the show, you know, I have, you know, decades of photographs to go through, but I just picked the ones that I thought was more representative of my interaction, and I call it the awe of nature.
All right. Thank you, Chuck. Before we open it up to the audience, I'm wondering if any of the artists have questions for their colleagues here.
I have a question for Charles. Which painters really inspired you to come back into painting, or was it just the whole process?
I think I'm longing for 1968 and 9 or something like that, you know. And my dad just died, and I remember different fun things we did. He helped me through art school, and there's the golf thing there too. And but those pop guys, you know, I also like shaped canvases, color field, hard edge, soft edge, minimal kind of work. But I'm only one person. Boy, I'd like to do a lot of different art things. But and you do, like you say, your nature. You have to be. You want to be a beer, and you don't have to do everything all the time. But I have a question for you. In the light, you're talking about the light. It's very frustrating, and you know, when you paint indoors and it's kind of dark, you sell a paint to someone who hangs it in a bright, or you paint outdoors and your painting's a little darker, and someone buys it and hangs it in the dark room. And I just read where Thomas Eakins had the same problem, that the light doesn't match where the painting ends up. So, I don't know.
I forget who the painter was, and it was he or she, and it might have even been Joan Mitchell, and it was like, you know, once the painting is sold, you know, I'm not responsible anymore. So.
Yeah.
John, do you have any questions?
No, I just really honored to be up here with you. Thank you.
Anyone
Hey,
else?
you know what?
Anyone else?
Back in art school, like I say, I like the late 1960s. So I came up with a pseudonym. I painted for a while under the name of Piero della Stella. And for those of you who take an art history, I'm glad you were amused by that. And I had a little luck as Leonardo da Hartford for a while too, but that was for the work where I thought it looked too much like Richard Long or Jackie Winsor. You know, when I worked with brush and sticks, you know, I thought it looked too much like what was already being done. So I had a little fun with that. Okay, I guess.
Thank you, Charles.